Today, we're going to talk about rifles that should have stayed in the design phase. We're talking heavy, awkward, and downright obnoxious things that made you wish for a bow and arrow. From recoil that'll launch you into next week to jamming actions that make you lose faith in humanity. These rifles earn their spots in the shoulda, coulda, woulda Hall of Fame. Grab a seat because we're about to dive into the flops of firearm history. Alright rookies, here's a history lesson in battlefield creativity or desperation. You ever wanted to shoot around a corner without exposing yourself? Well, so did a lot of soldiers. World War I gave us periscope rifles. A rifle with mirrors so you could fire from a trench. Clever, but a little clunky. Then World War II rolled around and the Germans took it up a notch with the Krummlauf, a curved barrel attachment for the STG-44 assault rifle. The idea was to fire from cover or inside a tank without peeking out. Sounds pretty smart, but physics had other ideas. Bullets don't like bending. The 90-degree version shattered rounds inside the barrel. The 30-degree version kinda worked, but it burned out after 250 shots. Accuracy? Well, let's just say you had better odds throwing the bullet. In the end, only a few hundred were made before the war ended, and no army has ever tried it again. Lesson learned, if you need to shoot around corners, you might want to rethink your strategy or just get a good mirror. Alright, so picture this, you're in Vietnam, knee-deep in jungle muck, and your brand new state-of-the-art M16 rifle just jammed harder than a high school garage band. Yeah, the early M16s had problems. Big ones. When the rifles first hit the battlefield in the mid-60s, the US military sold it as some space-age wonder weapon. No need to clean it, they said. Self-cleaning, they said, except that was a lie. See, the original M16 was shipped out with no cleaning kits, no instructions, and a magazine full of false promises. Add in high humidity, fine jungle dirt, and the military's decision to switch to a cheaper, dirtier gunpowder, and suddenly these rifles were jamming like it was their full-time job. Soldiers in the field couldn't even extract spent casings, sometimes having to ram rods down the barrel just to clear them. Meanwhile, the enemy wasn't exactly waiting patiently for them to sort things out. As you can imagine, the backlash was so bad the military had to scramble to fix it, adding chrome-lined chambers, improving the buffer system, and finally admitting that yes, guns do in fact need cleaning. The later M16A1 model actually worked, and by the time the kinks were ironed out, the M16 became one of the most widely used rifles in history. But that early rollout, woo, certified disaster. Imagine pulling up to a gunfight and your rifle decides it's on strike. That's the level of betrayal some soldiers felt. So next time someone tells you that they don't make them like they used to, remind them. Sometimes that's a good thing. Oh, the Ross rifle, Canada's ambitious attempt at making its own infantry rifle. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well, eh? Back in the early 1900s, Britain was stingy with their Lee Enfields, and so Canada said, fine, we'll make our own. Enter Sir Charles Ross, a British aristocrat with big ideas in a rifle factory. The Ross Mark III was sleek, accurate, and deadly. Well, on a shooting range, that is. In the mud and chaos of World War I trenches, not so much. Suppose you're in battle, bullets flying, and your rifle jams. You curse, you smack it, maybe even cry a little, and then you chuck it and grab a Lee Enfield off the nearest unfortunate soul. That's exactly what Canadian soldiers did. The Ross was too precise for its own good, choking on dirt and bad British ammo. Minister of Militia Sir Sam Hughes swore it was the best rifle of all time. And the troops disagreed pretty loudly. By 1916, the Ross was yanked from service and Hughes got the boot. Ironically, snipers loved the Ross for its accuracy, if they weren't in a trench. But for everyone else, well, it was a war zone paperweight. Moral of the story, if you design a rifle, make sure it actually works when it matters. You can't see it, but I'm winking at you. Alright, let's talk about why this cannon masquerading as a revolver was the absolute worst choice you could have made. First off, the size. This thing is a boat anchor. Carrying this thing's like lugging around a center block. Then there's the weight that comes with that size. At 54 ounces empty, you're one range session away from carpal tunnel. The moment you squeeze the trigger, you're not just firing a .44 Magnum, you're engaging in a full-body workout. You better have the forearm strength of a blacksmith or this thing is going airborne. Let's talk about those scope mounts too. If you ever thought about putting a scope on a revolver, let me introduce you to the concept of bad decisions. Not only do they loosen up after a few dry fires, but they also exist in a state of perpetual betrayal, taunting you from the barrel like a factory-engraved regret. And don't get me started on the legalese Ruger decided to slap onto the barrel. Nothing says fine craftsmanship like a giant warning label. Might as well get it engraved with I made a mistake while you're at it. The bottom line, if you need a blunt force weapon that also happens to fire bullets, congratulations, you found it. But if you're looking for a practical sidearm, friend, you brought a dump truck to a street race. Moving forward, let's talk about the late model M43 sniper rifle, because someone has to. Imagine you're a Spanish sniper in the 1960s squinting through your scope, lining up the perfect shot, and your rifle whispers, "Nah, let's make this interesting." The thing was a disaster. First off, they slapped a cheap Japanese 10x Marine scope on it, back when Japanese optics were about as clear as a beer bottle at the bottom of a swamp. Then, instead of actually designing a proper mount, they just welded random metal bits together like a drunk handyman with a blowtorch. To hold the scope in place? Yeah, cheap thumbscrew rings that probably came from a bargain bin. Now, imagine firing this Franken rifle. The scope shifts, the zero's off, and suddenly your bullet's headed toward Portugal. Meanwhile, your target is very much not impressed, and yet somehow Spain's military kept using it for years. Which raises the question, who did this rifle actually work for? Well, probably the enemy. Final verdict? If you ever find yourself holding one, just put it down and walk away. You'll hit more targets throwing rocks. Folks, if there's a golden rule in firearms, it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The AK-47 is legendary, cheap, tough, and idiot-proof. But Hungary looked at perfection and said, no, we should mess this up. Enter the AMD-65, the rifle equivalent of putting square wheels on a truck. First off, they chopped off the barrel down to 12 inches. That means less accuracy, less range, and more wasted bullets. Then, for reasons unknown to man, they slapped a metal handguard that turns into a branding iron after a few shots. Need to actually aim? Well, too bad. They shrunk the sight radius, making it about as precise as throwing rocks. And the stock? Oh, buddy. It's a flimsy wire contraption that makes a gun front-heavy and impossible to shoulder properly. Oh, let me guess, you might want to aim down those sights too. Well, good luck, unless you enjoy smashing your teeth in. Yet in 2005, the US government thought this disaster was perfect for the Afghan police. Turns out they hated it. Not only did it suck to shoot, but it was also unreliable. A crime for an AK-based weapon. So if you take the perfect design and ruin everything that made it great, you don't get innovation, you get the AMD-65. Listen, I love a good rifle as much as the next red-blooded hunter, but the Winslow rifle? That thing was less of a firearm and more of a bedazzled fashion statement. First off, it was heavy, like Skip Arm Day Forever heavy. If you're tracking game, you don't want to feel like you're hauling an anvil. Then there's the design. One part rifle, one part space-age fever dream. The Plains Master stock looked like something Flash Gordon would carry, not a serious hunter. And then there's the shine. This thing was polished to the point where it could double as a signal flare. Imagine stalking a caribou only for your rifle to catch the sun and practically Morse code your location to every animal in the next time zone. Subtlety? Never heard of it. Now, I'm not going to knock the craftsmanship. The engraving, the inlays, the bluing are all top notch. So good, in fact, that people started treating Winslows like collector's items instead of tools. You don't bring a Rembrandt into the woods, and you sure as hell don't want to scratch up a rifle that costs more than your truck. Bottom line, the Winslow was built for admiration, not action, so if you ever see one, do what the animals learn to do. Stay far, far away. Here's a tea about the M14, America's short-lived jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none battle rifle. It was supposed to be the next big thing, the heir to the mighty M1 Garand. Instead, it became the rifle equivalent of a muscle car with a bad transmission. Powerful, but a real pain to handle. First off, it kicked like a mule on caffeine. The M14 fired the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, which was great for putting holes in things, but made full auto fire about as controllable as a fire hose in a hurricane. The US military technically made it select fire, but any soldier who flipped that switch instantly realized it was a mistake. I mean, the recoil made accuracy a joke, turning aim shots into unplanned aerial fireworks displays. Then there was a wait, because who doesn't love carrying a 10+ pound hunk of wood and steel through the jungle? By the time you slapped on a loaded magazine, a sling, and any attachments, it felt like you were lugging around a center block. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong were skipping through the trees with their lightweight, indestructible AK-47s, spraying lead like it was on clearance. Oh, and the stock warping issue. Yes, the M14 originally had a beautifully wooden stock. But Vietnam's humidity turned it into a sponge. It would swell, shrink, or just plain twist, throwing off accuracy. And what's the fix, you might ask? Well, swap into fiberglass after it became a problem. And the final nail in the coffin, it was outdated the moment it was issued. The M14 tried to be an all-in-one solution. Battle rifle, automatic rifle, squad weapon, but in the end, it was too much gun for some jobs and not enough for others. The US Army realized this real quick and swapped out for the lighter, more controllable M16 within a few years. That's right, folks, the M14 was so bad that the military traded it in for the first-gen M16, a rifle that had its own legendary list of problems. That should tell you everything. The SA-80 is a proof that even the great British Empire can produce a military rifle so bad it makes tea taste bitter. Designed in the 1980s, the SA-80 L85A1 was supposed to be Britain's ultimate battle rifle. Instead, it turned out to be a jam-prone, heavy, and downright embarrassing mess. First off, this thing hated dirt more than a rich guy's lawyer. A little dust? Jammed. A little bit of mud? Jammed. A mean look? Yeah, you guessed it, probably jammed. Soldiers in the Gulf War quickly realized their rifle had the reliability of a car with a flat tire, except in a firefight, you don't get roadside assistance. And let's talk ergonomics. The SA-80 is a bullpup, meaning the magazine is behind the trigger. Sounds cool in theory, but the designers must have forgotten humans have hands. Because guess what? The safety was in a real weird spot. The cock and handle, clumsy as heck. And you left-handed shooters out there, well, tough luck, mate. If you were a southpaw, firing the SA-80 meant getting a face full of hot brass. And then there's the weight. Despite being compact, it was built like a British pub brawler. Dense, awkward, and difficult to handle. The original bipod was a flimsy joke, and the plastic parts were about as durable as a cheap toy. By the early 2000s, the Brits had to send the SA-80 to H&K. Yes, the Germans, to fix it. When the people who make Glocks have to save your rifle, you know you messed up. Okay, now we have the Nambu Type 11, Japan's first ever LMG, a light machine gun. And by light, I mean light on usefulness. This thing was designed by Kijiro Nambu, a man who apparently thought, what if we made a machine gun that actively sabotages its own operator? First up, the ammo system was a disaster. Instead of using detachable box or belt like a normal LMG, the Type 11 had this goofy hopper-fed mechanism that you had to manually load with rifle clips. That meant your assistant gunner had to stand there shoving clips in one by one while you fired. Assuming you could fire, because this thing jammed if you looked at it wrong. And then there was a recoil spring setup, which was housed in the buttstock, so every time you pulled the trigger, the whole stock literally tried to punch you in the shoulder, like the gun was mad at you for using it. Oh, and let's not forget the dust problem. Japan designed this thing for the clean training grounds at home, not the muddy, dusty battlefields of China and the Pacific. The moment dirt got in there, which it always did, the Type 11 immediately decided it was done with life. By World War II, Japan had wisely moved on to the Type 96 and Type 99, leaving the Type 11 to rust in military storage or in the hands of some very unlucky soldiers. The verdict? A machine gun that jammed, kicked like a mule, and needed a babysitter just to reload. If I had to pick between this and a rock, I'm gonna take the rock. This is the rifle that started as World War II's Japanese battle tool and ended up as the what not to do example for firearm enthusiasts. Arisaka was a beast on the battlefield in her original form. Tough, reliable, and very much built for war, but somewhere along the way, some bright-eyed idea came around to improve this sturdy warhorse into civilian rifle. And that's when the sporterization disaster began. Sporterizing a gun's like trying to turn a bulldozer into a sports car. It just doesn't work. First of all, people cut down those historic full-length stocks trying to make the gun somehow lighter and easier for hunting. And the result was the balance of the rifle that just went out the window. You got a top-heavy mess that handles like an angry porcupine. Now let's talk history too. Arisakas were built for war, not baby soft hunting. As a war gun, it was functional, but once someone got their hands on it to make it pretty, and I use that term loosely, for civilian use, it all lost that military toughness. The gun was used, beaten up, and chopped to bits by amateur gunsmiths with zero respect for the old girl's legacy. So in short, sporterizing an Arisaka is like turning a Sherman tank into a go-kart. It just wasn't meant to be, and we all paid the price. Collectors might be drooling over the flashy inlays and mirror-like finish, but when the chips are down, you need grit, not some glorified display piece that's all flash and no kick. In short, this thing was like taking a heavyweight champ and dressing him up like a tuxedo. Sure, it looks sharp, but it's not winning any street brawls with that getup. So if you're hunting for a reliable stick to watch your six, keep your eyes peeled for the originals. The sporterized ones are just too pretty to perform. Imagine the early 1700s and some clever chap named James Puckle thinks, hey, why not crank out a machine gun? So he invents a Puckle Gun, a revolving, volley-firing contraption that was supposed to change warfare forever. But here's the kicker. Instead of being the rock star of the battlefield, this beast turned out to be as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Sure, it could fire off a barrage of rounds, but with its clunky design, slow reload, and general unpredictability, it made it a total flop. It was heavy, complicated, and frankly more trouble than it was worth. Soldiers weren't exactly lining up to lug around a piece of artillery that looked like a steampunk nightmare. And let's not forget its oddball ammunition. Square bullets for certain foes and round ones for others. Talk about overthinking your bullet design. In the end, the Puckle Gun became more of a curiosity than a battlefield hero. It wasn't built for the harsh realities of combat, and history remembered it as a flashy idea that never got off the ground. Moral of the story here? Just because you can build a repeating gun doesn't mean you should. Some ideas are best left on the drawing board. The INSAS was supposed to be India's homegrown answer to modern warfare, but it turned out to be about as reliable as a flip-flop in a monsoon. Designed with an AKM backbone and a few fancy extras, it looked promising on paper, but when it hit the rugged Kargil heights, its plastic magazines cracked in the cold, and its firing mechanism jammed more than a diner on a Sunday morning. You small towners know what I'm talking about. Soldiers on the front line weren't having it. A misbehaving rifle that suddenly switched from burst to full auto wasn't exactly the feature they signed up for. Instead of being the trusty tool every grunt could depend on, the INSAS or INSAS became a constant headache, leaving Jawans scrambling for more of a dependable weapon in the heat of battle. And let's not forget the quality issues from those old state-run factories. It was like they were churning out parts on a shoestring budget rather than a precision instrument. In the end, you're up against the enemies and your rifle's acting like it's got a mind of its own. Well, you're better off with a gun that doesn't quit on you. And that's why the Army eventually ditched INSAS for imported rifles that actually get the job done. Cowpokes, this Savage 340 ain't the crown jewel of bolt-action rifles, no sir. Sure, it's cheap and it'll shoot, but it's built like a budget pickup that's seen too many hard roads. First off, the trigger pull is rougher than a cactus handshake. You squeeze that trigger and it kicks back like a mule that's had too much coffee. Then there's the magazine, flimsy little box made of thin stamped metal that can be as temperamental as a wild Mustang. Load it up and half the time the cartridges decide to play hide and seek, jamming up your action at the worst possible moment. And if you're thinking of mounting a scope, well, don't hold your breath. The factory did a number on that too. The bolt handle and off-center scope mount leaves you squinting like a varmint hunter in a dust storm just trying to line up a shot. The bottom line, the Savage 340 is a quirky no-frills rifle that might suit a thrifty beginner, but it'll test your patience like a day-old boot in a rattlesnake pit. If you're after good reliability and smooth shooting, you're better off spending a few extra dollars on something that won't make you feel like you're wrestling a bronco every time you pull the trigger. In the end, these rifles weren't just bad, they were a lesson in what not to do when designing a weapon. From awkward recoil to frustrated soldiers shaking their fists at malfunctioning gear, these guns show us one thing: not every rifle makes the cut. So, next time you're in the market for a weapon, remember, more bells and more whistles doesn't always mean better aim. So, stay smart, comrades. That's all for now.